So about 10 years ago, I'm sitting in an ICU waiting room. My mom had been in the hospital for about a month at that point. And when you're in the ICU for that long, you see a lot of people come and go because you're in a waiting room with people that are going through some of the worst things that you can imagine. You know, they're worried about their loved ones and they're hoping that they're going to get to see them again. And the thing that I learned is a lot of people don't. A lot of people go through some really hard things in that waiting room with a group of total strangers like me. And for a month, I just witnessed people, like one right after the other, losing people they care about and trying to get through it in this, this sterile environment. And they're going through the worst things they've ever gone through in front of people they've never met before. And of course, inevitably, our time came too, and I had to do the same thing. And I remember sitting in there and seeing all this happen to these people, and then happen to us. And I remember asking, God, where are you? I'm having a hard time finding you right now in this. You could easily make some of these people's lives better, yet it just keeps happening. I keep seeing it over and over and over again. And then I remember Thanksgiving Day. We just had Thanksgiving, and I remember Thanksgiving Day, we're sitting in the ICU, and these people that didn't know us, that didn't know any of the people in the room, they just kept coming and bringing food and giving people hugs and trying to be joyful for them because they knew that these people were going through and living some of the worst moments of their life. And these people from all over Scott County and Fayette County and Harrison County and Bourbon County, Rockcastle County, they were coming into this ICU room with cookies and food, and it was just insane all day long, wanting to make sure that we had everything that we needed, and they just loved on us all day long. And my perspective changed. God hadn't left. He wasn't nowhere to be found. He was in his people. And they were coming to us, and they were showing us grace and mercy and bringing us joy when we had very little. And after my mom passed away, I went home that night, and I went to bed. And the next day, I sat down and I wrote this song. And I remember sitting there thinking, God, I feel like I should be mad. I feel like I should be so upset at you, but you've been with us through it all. You made sure that you were there through all these people that I'd never met before. And so my perspective had changed. And I wrote this song because in that moment, I truly felt like God's love was crazy. It just seemed insane to me that he would love his people like that, and that he would use his people like that, and that he had a plan. I learned that day that he has a plan literally for every one of us. Every person in this room he has a plan for you. And it might just be as simple as you go into an ICU waiting room, but it means a whole lot to some people that when they have no joy left, God uses his people for that. So I wrote this song, and I hope you guys will listen to the words, and if you pick up on them, feel free to sing along. But it's just about how God's love is crazy. It's called Madness. Well, I don't understand how you could love a fool like me, how you could see me as your child, how you could love me as your own. No, I don't understand how you can strip this sin away, or how you see right through this fraud and believe in me this way. Your love is madness. Your love is madness. Your love is madness. Your love is madness. And I don't understand how your grace can cover me like the shade, or how you sent your only Son to save a hypocrite like me. Your love is madness. 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 All glory and honor and power are yours. All glory and honor and power are yours. All glory and honor and power are yours. But your love is mine. Your love is madness. 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 Your love is madness.
The book of Psalms has Psalms where you think the psalmist couldn't be happier, couldn't be closer to the Lord. And then at the same time, there are Psalms where you think there's no way in the world I could ever be as low as David is, for example, in a psalm. It's kind of like a mixed bag of nuts there. You've got great highs and you've got great lows. And I love the book of Psalms. You know, historically, the book of Psalms is the most quoted book in the Old Testament book quoted in the New Testament. And historically, the book of Psalms has been viewed as the key to discipleship. How to become more like Jesus. Well, it's the secret in church history is found in the book of Psalms. See, as we read the Psalms and study the Psalms and make those a part of our lives, the character, the virtues that come from the Psalms, when you take that onto yourself, you become the type of man or woman that the Lord has intended for us to be. Today we look at one of my favorite Psalms, Psalm 13. And I love the Psalm because of the crudeness of it, the harshness of it. It's kind of like my grandmother-in-law, she says to the girls often, she says, girls, make sure you take your elbows off the table. Don't talk with your mouth full. Why? Well, you can't do that in front of the queen, right? You've said that to your kids maybe? Or your husbands? Whatever. Here's the thing. we often take that picture and we apply it to God. Well, you can't talk to God with your elbows on the table or with food in your mouth. You can't show God that dark side, the hurt. But we see here in this Psalm 13 as an example, we see David doesn't hide his hurt. See, God's big enough to deal with David's hurt, his frustration, his feelings. Psalm 13, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to read it in its entirety, and then we'll come back and we'll walk through it verse by verse. Psalm 13, it's not long, it's just 6 verses. A powerful 6 verses. As we read this together, it'll be on the screen with us. I want to ask you, not only read it with your ears and your eyes, but imagine. Read it with your hearts. These are real feelings and emotions that are penned. And so try to hear it. Don't like James Earl Jones it in your head, you know? Like we read scriptures sometimes and we're like, yes, the Lord is good to me. And we like make it pretty, you know? As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you. But what we see instead is not like pretty, like t-shirt type Christian stuff. It's hard. It's hurtful. It's real. Read it along with me. Hear it in your minds and your hearts. David writes this, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long, God, will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemies be exalted over me? Consider me and answer, O God. I lift up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say I have prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice because I'm shaken. But I've trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Look back at verse 1. We see David's writing this, and David writes this to the choir master. The superscript tells us. David writes this to the choir master. Now, we don't know who the choir master is. We look at this text, and many people will say, well, the choir master would be the person who leads us in song, like Matt. The person who would be leading the people of God toward the temple in song, or to the temple and in the temple in song. But we don't know that, but we do know who David is. And that's why one of the reasons I love this psalm is because we know David wrote this. David is Israel's greatest king ever. David is the man after God's own heart, and yet hear his words this morning. He starts off in verse 1. He says, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? Consider this for just a moment. 4 times in these first 2 verses, David asks, how long, Lord? How long? I think we've all kind of been there at times, haven't we? How long? You know, notice it's not why. He's not asking why, God. He's asking how long. The implication there is, is that David knows why he's feeling this way. Maybe it's a sin of David's. Maybe it's a sin of someone else's or the people. His question isn't why, instead it's how long. And it gives you the impression that, and I think we know this to be true. If you know there's an expiration date, if you know there's light at the end of the tunnel, then often we feel like we could go through anything if we just know how long, God, how long am I going to be going through this? How long are we going to deal with these feelings? How long, God, are you going to forget me? Now notice, David feels like God has forgotten him. David feels like God has hidden his face from him. But realize David's feelings, while they're true to him, they're not based on fact. God hasn't neglected David. He hasn't forgotten David. In the Bible, to remember, for God to remember his people, is a willing action on behalf of his people. To remember is always associated not with a cognitive thing of remembering, but it's always acting on behalf of. So when God remembers his Israelites, he acts in their favor. David's saying, God, have you forgotten me? Are you willingly neglecting me? Are you willingly not acting in my favor? How long will you forget me and not act in my favor? How long will you hide your face from me? Again, picture when we use the terminology, well, God's face shined upon us. It means, well, we feel God's blessings, God's favor upon us. David says, God, I'm not feeling you. I'm not feeling you with me. I'm not feeling you here. I'm not experiencing your blessings. I guess we've probably all can say we've been in a position similar to that at some point or another, haven't we? We don't see the blessings we once had. David feels like God is absent from him, but God is not. That doesn't change the fact that David feels it. Sometimes our feelings make a reality around us that isn't based on fact. How long will you hide your face from me? And see, our temptation is to, when we have these feelings, is to listen to the words of others, maybe well-intentioned, that say, look, you can't talk like that. You can't talk to God like that. But what's David do? David leans into it, doesn't he? He says, God, look, you know my feelings. Why do we feel like we have to hide this part of our lives from the Lord? The Lord knows it. So David leans into it and he directs his complaints to God, his complaints. David's complaining to the Lord, directly to him. It's good to find this in David, a man after God's own heart. Yet this is a time when David feels that God has abandoned him entirely. He doesn't cover it up. David says how it is. He feels abandoned by God, and he lets God know he feels that way. And if he can say it, we can say it too. God can deal with these emotions that we have at times. And sometimes our feelings create their own reality, and in that way they are true for us, but they're not true based on facts. The extreme would be to ignore feelings altogether, and there are some people who try to do that, but that's a dangerous thing. The Lord gave us feelings. But the other extreme is to lead life with our feelings, which is just as dangerous. Sometimes our feelings are wrong. We can feel something, and that feeling is true to that feeling, but it's wrong because it's not based on fact. For example, if I received a phone call today, and a dear family member of mine, I'm told on the phone, hey, your family member is dead. Well, I would respond in grief and sadness and anger and frustration and all kinds of feelings, right? Well, imagine 30 minutes later I get another phone call. There's been a tragic mistake, and that family member is not dead after all. It was a complete mistake, and they're fine, and they inherited $10,000, right? Like let's just go to extremes. My feelings were still true. I felt that, but my feeling wasn't based on truth. And that's where we find David. David says, God, I feel like you've abandoned me. Your face isn't shining on me. I feel this in a real way. But it's not based on truth. What causes this type of depression in our lives? Consider this for a second. 4 times he says, God, how long? How long will you hide your face from me? How long will I feel disconnected from you? In verse 2, he says, how long, God, will I have to look into my own heart, into my own life, and feel this sorrow? What causes this? Well, sometimes it's a prolonged struggle, isn't it? So, sometimes whatever we're facing is just, it feels like it's enduring forever. It's never going to end. We don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. Sometimes it's the lack of apparent blessing. You know, consider when you're first married and you're madly in love and everything's great and you're just kind of in that honeymoon season. But as the years pass by, you start to grow maybe apart or different. And all of a sudden you look and that's not the woman I married and that's not the man I married, and you become ships sailing in the night, and you look back and you say, hey, God, there was a time where you're blessing, you blessed our early marriage, but things have changed and now it just looks so much different. Have you removed your blessing on our marriage? Or maybe it's with kids, and like your kids are young and sweet and kind, and they're like God's little creatures, and you love them as they're young, but then they start to grow, and when they grow, they bring in conflict and pain and frustration, and you start saying, God, have you removed your blessing here? Have you removed the blessing here that my child who was once just so wonderful is now just bringing pain and hurt into our home? Have you forgotten me? Maybe it's with work and the business that once, or the job that you once loved to go to and be a part of. Well, the business has become stagnant. You've kind of hit your limit or whatever, and you just don't find the joy that you once found in it. You know, this is possible in a church as well. You go through seasons of rapid growth and everything is great. Everything you do is just a success and the Lord's glorified. You see many people come and surrender their lives to the Lord, but then you enter into a time where things kind of change and they become stagnant. Maybe churches are shut down because of COVID. Maybe life at church just seems different. Families that you once see have kind of drifted away from the church, and you say, God, have you removed your blessing from the ministry here? What causes these depressions? Some people, it's good to acknowledge that some people are just more prone to depression and these types of feelings. Some people, and it's good for us to understand and to realize as we walk through and start to assess these situations, some of us are just more wired to be more prone to depression. That doesn't solve it. Understanding that doesn't get rid of the depression, but it can help us as we evaluate our lives. Sometimes a prolonged sickness will lead us into depression. We've been sick and chronically ill for some time, and it just becomes like, God, where are you? All of a sudden, I'm sick. Sometimes it happens after a mountaintop experience. Consider 1 Kings chapter 19. Elijah was good. He was strong while they were in battle at Mount Carmel. Like as long as they were in battle, man, things were good. And then after the battle, he sank into such a low depression. He says, God, am I the only one faithful in Israel? Which is really just, he was having a pity party for himself. You ever been there? Happened to me. What Elijah needed, instead of his pity party, he needs rest. Sometimes that happens for us because of a lack of rest and because of continuing a mountaintop experience. Sometimes immediately following that, we can go into the dumps. Sometimes this is caused by our enemies. That's what David points out. He says, look, God, if you don't do something, my enemies are going to laugh. They're going to mock. They're going to think they've triumphed over me. Sometimes our enemies are attacking. Now, here's the thing. David had enemies that you and I hopefully will never have. I mean, Saul's trying to kill David at one point in his life. Hopefully that's not the case for any of us. No one's actively trying to kill us. But it is important to remember that Peter tells us that our adversary is Satan. And he's like a roaring lion, was looking to see who he can devour. Sometimes enemies and the attacks of our enemies will sink us into this depression where we say, God, how long are you going to turn your back on us? How long will you not be available? How long will you not answer my cries? Haven't you heard me pray? How long must I pray for the same prayer, for the same healing, for the same thing? How long, Lord? We've all been in that situation. Look what David does in this. David doesn't hide his emotion. Instead, he takes it directly to God. He voices his concerns, but then look at what happens in verse 3. Consider and answer me, God. You know, his first, in verse 1, he complains, God, how long? How long are you going to be distant? So now he asks, God, consider me. How long will you hide your face from me? How long will your blessings not be apparent? He says, God, answer me. His request here in verse 3 is directly in proportion to his complaint in verse 1. The fact that we feel abandoned ought to give us a little bit of comfort. What I mean is this. To be abandoned, we need to understand that to be abandoned, there needs to be someone to be abandoned by. Another way of saying it, I heard this said once, the sun proves the shadows. I'm sorry, the shadows prove the sun. I did it backwards, see? Just seeing if y'all are awake. the shadows prove the sunlight. When it's dark and cloudy outside, we don't question, well, does the sun really exist? When we can't see the sun, we don't question, God, is there really a sun back there? And instead, we look at the shadows and we say, look, the shadows there, that means there must be a source. To feel this abandonment that David feels, he knows that, God, you haven't abandoned me. I just feel it. I know you're still there. And so he directs his requests to God. God, consider me. Just because we don't feel God's presence, we learn this from David's example. Just because we don't feel his presence, that doesn't mean we stop praying. Even when it's hard, we continue to pray. And I think maybe God waits for that desperation at times, where we know that I don't have the strength to pull myself up by the bootstraps. I think maybe God sometimes waits for us to feel that desperation so we lean more fully into him. And in those times, as David does, we pray. He says, God, consider me, answer me, give light to my eyes. His feelings tell him that God has turned his face away. And so the first thing David asks is for God to turn around and look in his direction once again. His feelings say that God is never talking to him again. And so he asks God, answer me. Enlighten my eyes so that I can see things right. See, David understands that just because I feel this doesn't make it fact. And so God, give me a new way of seeing this life around me. Give me a new way to see reality. Because maybe I'm missing something. Enlighten my eyes. Or else I'll sleep the sleep of death. A lot of us walk around in that sleep of death. We are so focused on the trouble and the pain around us that we can't ask, or we don't think to ask the Lord for new vision, for new perspective. Look what David does back in verse 2 again. He says, God, these I surround, continually look inside of myself for answers. He says, God, I keep looking inside trying to find. It's a morbid, introspective type thinking. And sometimes that's what we do. Instead of asking God to enlighten our eyes, we look at ourselves and we say, God, look, I know things were good at one point, and we were good, and there was growth, but now we've kind of plateaued, and it's because you're mad at me. God, are you angry with me? And we become morbidly introspective, and when we look for these things inside, and we try to analyze the trouble that we're going through. When God says, just drop your trouble, lay it down, give it to me. Trouble's like a pill, see, a pill that you're supposed to just take and let down and give it to the Lord. But instead of taking the pill, we keep it in our mouth and we chew on it. God says, give it to me. Don't look inside yourself. Give it to me. Look at verse 5. Verses 1 and 2 of Psalm 13, David has his complaint. Verses 3 and 4, David asks the Lord for a new way of seeing things. Give light to my eyes. Hear me again. Turn your face to me. Give me a new vision. In verses 5 and 6. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. I love that word, that steadfast love. In the Hebrew, it's hesed love. It is the loyal love of God. This is not just love that you would have for another person. This is God's loyal love, his faithful love. The love that is not just something that you feel, but it's a character of who God is. And so David says, God, I've trusted in your faithful love, your loyal love. The love that is not dependent on my actions and how I live. It's tied directly to your character, God. And I've trusted in your character. God, you've made promises, and you're faithful to those promises all the time. God, your faithfulness, your loyal love, I've trusted in. And so he says, my heart shall rejoice. I love that. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. It's like David's talking to himself. And he says, look, feelings, I know you're not there. You're wanting to tear me down, but I will rejoice. He's talking to his emotions. He's putting them in check and saying, look, I'm not being led by you. I'm not being guided by you. Instead, I'm going to choose to rejoice. When I can't trust in anything else, I can trust in God's steadfast love, his loyal love, and my heart will rejoice in your salvation. Look at verse 6. I will sing, he says, to the Lord, because he has dealt bountifully with me. I love the NIV, just makes it very simple. He says, I will sing to the Lord because he has been good to me. Even when I don't feel it, I can trust that regardless of what I walk through in this life, God, you have been good to me. And because you have been good to me in the past, I can walk forward knowing that you will be good to me in the future. And because of that, even though I don't feel it, I'm going to choose to walk forward in you. Even though I can't feel it, I choose to worship. I will sing. While David can't control the pressure on top of him, he might not be able to control his emotions. He has the choice to respond to the Lord in the same way that we have today. Regardless of what we're dealing with in our lives, regardless of the circumstances and the situations that might press upon us, even though we might not see the light at the end of the tunnel, we can choose today to worship, to lean into God's steadfastness, his faithfulness, his loyal love. And we can choose to sing. That's a short Psalm of David, 6 verses in all, but it gives us a great picture of how to complain and when we need peace in our lives. When we're being pressed on all sides, David gives us a great model to help us resolve that, to help us to walk through those things. On the tables as you leave today, there's an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and it kind of gives you this text, and it kind of highlights the outline of David's prayer here. He directs God, he addresses God directly. He doesn't have to hide it. He says, God, here's how I feel. Here's my issues, and here's why you should answer my requests. Here's how I'm feeling. And I'm going to promise to praise. Several times in my life, in my personal prayer time, I've used this model to help me process through emotions and feelings and issues that are going on. I mean, it's been a huge blessing for me. And I want to encourage you to take some of those. And maybe you can write your own psalm to the Lord. It's often called a psalm of lament or disorientation. When things are not as they should be, we can respond the way David responds, which is much better than just complaining on Facebook. Because this response, this complaint, ends in a praise. I want to point out one other thing as we finish up this psalm, because I'm pretty much done. But I want to look at how do we see Jesus in this psalm. Because I don't know if you're aware, like throughout the Old Testament, we can always see this red line of Jesus throughout Scripture. So where do we see Jesus in this? Well, verse 1 and 2, David asks Jesus, God, how long will you hide your face from me? Jesus doesn't ask how long, but he asks why. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He says that from the cross, looking back to a psalm much like this song, a song of disorientation that points out the pain but ends in the praise. Where do we see Jesus in this? Well, David's complaining. He says, God, if you don't do something, light up my eyes or I'll sleep the sleep of death. We can be reminded that Jesus never slept the sleep of death. Instead of that sleep of death, Jesus rose 3 days later. And his resurrection offers us hope and peace so that we can walk forward in steadfastness, knowing that God is faithful to his people at all times. He's faithful. In verse 5, David says, I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation because you have been good to me. We see an image, an echo of Jesus in that. We too today can rejoice in the salvation offered to us. And we do that every week here around this time where we look at this bread and this cup and we're reminded of the salvation that we've been invited to participate in. Jesus gave this bread and this wine a new meaning when he sat with his disciples the night he was betrayed, and he took the bread and he says, guys, I want you to remember that this bread represents my body. And this body of mine is sacrificed for you so that you can have the joy of salvation. Do this in remembrance of me. And when dinner was over, he took the cup and he said to his disciples, he says, guys, I want you to remember that this cup now represents my blood that's sacrificed for you. Do this in remembrance of me. I love this Psalm of David because it gives us a model to bring our grievances to the Lord. But it also gives us a model of praise. Even when things seem lost, when everything seems broken, I can respond to the Lord, not because of the circumstances around me, but instead because of your loyal love, your steadfast love. Even though I don't feel it, God, I know that you love me. I know you haven't turned your back on me, and I will respond in praise. And so that's the invitation today. We've kind of turned our service around, so we've got some extended time of worship here at the end. And I want to ask you to consider your heart and your mind and your thoughts and what's been going on in your day, in your week, in your year. And use this time, as David does, to respond appropriately, to worship God because of his steadfast love, because of his faithfulness.
In the eye of the storm, you remain in control. In the middle of the war, you guard my soul. You alone are the anchor when my sails are torn. Your love surrounds me in the eye of the storm. When the solid ground is falling out from underneath my feet, between the black skies and my red eyes, I can barely see. When I realize I've been sold out by my friends and family, I can feel the rain reminding me. In the eye of the storm, you remain in control. In the middle of the war, you guard my soul. You alone are the anchor. My sails are torn. Your love surrounds me in the eye of the storm. When my hopes and dreams are far from me and I'm running out of faith, I see the future I picture slowly fade away. When the pain and tears and heartache are pouring down my face, I find my peace in Jesus' name. In the eye of the storm, you remain in control. In the middle of the war, you guard my soul. You alone are the anchor when my sails are torn. Your love surrounds me in the eye of the storm. When the test comes in and the doctor says I've only got a few months left, it's like a bitter pill I'm swallowing. I can barely take a breath. When addiction steals my baby girl and there's nothing I can do, my only hope is to trust you. The eye of soul. You alone are the anchor when my sails are torn. Your love surrounds me in the eye of the storm. In the eye of the storm, you remain in control. Middle of a war, you guard my soul. You alone are the anchor when my sails are torn. Love surrounds me in the eye of the storm. We'll see you guys next week. Thank you so much for coming.